I'm a history nerd, and have always been especially interested in historical figures who found themselves at the intersection of history, adventure, and nature. People like Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, Ernest Shackleton and Edmund Hillary. But one figure has always captured my imagination more than others: Theodore Roosevelt. If America could be summarized by the life of one single individual, Teddy Roosevelt would make a great candidate. Courageous, brash, intelligent, and progressive, but also flawed and fraught with tragedy. Roosevelt lived an incredibly full life and left an indelible mark on the United States. You would not think that a sickly child born in New York City in 1858 would grow up to become an accomplished naturalist, rancher, hunter, conservationist, and eventually President of the United States. But that's exactly what happened. From an early age, with inspiration from his father, one of the founders of the American Museum of Natural History, Teddy Roosevelt was collecting insect and mammal specimens and making detailed observations about the natural world. Some of these collections from what he dubbed the Roosevelt Natural History Museum are still housed in the Smithsonian Institute today. Roosevelt would formalize his naturalist education at Harvard, where he studied natural history. In 1884, Roosevelt's wife and mother died on the same day. In the face of this unfathomable grief, Roosevelt headed out to North Dakota to live what he called a more strenuous life, and avoid the distractions and memories of life in the East and deal with his grief. During this time, he began to see the effects of overgrazing and overhunting, and his thoughts about the importance of conservation began to materialize. In 1887, Roosevelt formed the Boone and Crockett Club with his friend George Bird Grinnell, founder of the first Audubon Society. The Boone and Crockett Club established fair chase rules for hunters and was instrumental in the expansion and protection of Yellowstone National Park. When Roosevelt assumed the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley, he made several trips that changed the course of conservation in the United States. A trip to Pelican Island in Florida eventually created a bird sanctuary, which would eventually evolve into the National Wildlife Refuge System. He also went to the Grand Canyon and would later establish Grand Canyon National Monument, which would soon become Grand Canyon National Park. His most famous trip of that year was a camping trip with his friend John Muir to Yosemite. Soon after, Yosemite Valley was soon added to the park. By the time his presidency concluded, Roosevelt had set aside 230 million acres of federal land, including 150 national forests, 51 bird preserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. The dark side of this massive conservation effort was that little or no consideration was given to the indigenous peoples that had called these areas home for thousands of years. Over 80 million acres of tribal land was transferred to the National Forest System during Roosevelt's tenure. Those Indians were often forced onto less productive and certainly less desirable reservations. Roosevelt's quest of knowledge and conservation didn't stop after he left office. In 1909, he took part in a Smithsonian expedition to Africa that would collect over 11,000 specimens. During the trip, Roosevelt helped sow a conservation attitude that finally grew and blossomed in the form of today's great game parks of East Africa. In 1913, after a failed bid to return to the presidency, Roosevelt went on an expedition sponsored by the American Museum of Natural History down the River of Doubt in the Amazon. The trip was fraught with danger from unknown tribes, rapids, and disease. Roosevelt suffered a leg injury which became infected and had him near death by the end of the expedition, and affected his health for the rest of his life. Roosevelt's quest for knowledge and desire for conservation forever changed America and is still shaping how we view our natural world over 100 years later. I hope you liked this different type of video, and if you did, please like and subscribe.